in the end, you have to have people who stand up and be accountable. You have to have people who are also prepared to be unpopular, be the only person in the cutting room who doesn't agree with everyone else.
The BBC is expected to issue what some are calling a grovelling apology for doctoring a Trump speech after the White House accused the corporation of outright lies. A Panorama episode broadcast a week before last year's US presidential election appeared to make edited clips together of the speech that Donald Trump made before people marched on the Capitol before the January 6th riots in 2021. And it appeared to show that President Trump was encouraging people to take violent action. Now, the White House responded strongly to the clip, which appears to show Trump telling the rioters, go to the Capitol building and fight like hell. The White House has branded it 100% fake news. Let's listen to the Panorama edit of the Trump speech.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like hell.
Well, just to give you some context, he did say, we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. That was one part of the speech. But another part of the speech, in a different passage, which Trump's defence lawyers are reminding people of, President Trump said, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Well, let's speak now to Roger Bolton, former BBC executive and presenter. Morning to you, Roger.
Morning.
Do you think that the BBC should be apologising for this?
Well, it should always apologise if she gets things wrong. And I think the tragedy of this situation, of course, is that in principle, that Panorama programme was a good and fair one. The edit was not and shouldn't have happened. And of course, we should remember the House of Representatives and the Senate itself voted that Trump had tried to organise what they called was a self-coup. That vote included 7 Republicans. Donald Trump called the election a big steal. He said all things about it. Subsequently, no evidence has come forward in any court elsewhere to suggest that's the case. He was out to thwart the democratic will of the American people. And he used language to encourage his supporters to come, and he knew who they were, and he probably kept just this side of incitement to violence, but not by much. So it's absolutely ludicrous, of course, for the White House to suggest that BBC is 100% propaganda. But it's vital that the BBC doesn't allow the basic reporting to be deflected by making a mistake like this.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's words speak for themselves. You can just present them and they tell the audience what they are. It doesn't need this editing. For people listening to this who maybe don't work in the media, haven't worked at the BBC, just explain how something like this could happen.
Well, I mean, there's the cock-up of the conspiracy, isn't there? And I was the former editor of Panorama, and I made the odd cock-up. So what happens often is that unless you have somebody in the room at the final edit, when you're cutting something down, cut, we'll lose another 30 seconds, do it. It's too easy, without any sort of malevolence or whatever, and knowing the background of what Trump said, to make an edit like that. Well, the edit wouldn't have mattered if they'd, put a little bit of black spacing in there and said 40 minutes later, he said this.
Yeah.
So there are two reasons. There are two possibilities, aren't there? One is it's malevolent. They deliberately tried to stitch Trump up. I don't believe that. The other is that they were so focused on what they were doing, and probably, not very sympathetic to Trump, that nobody noticed the significance of what happened. But that is what, in the end, editors and others are paid for, is to come in at the last minute and say, hold on, what's your evidence for that? Why have you cut that in that way? And so on.
Do you think there's an element here that it was made by an independent production company and the BBC maybe isn't overseeing independent production companies quite so clearly? I'm thinking back to the documentary which was done, and it was discovered by an independent. It was discovered that it was done by voice, narrated by, through the eyes of the son of a Hamas leader.
I think that does create great difficulties, and the BBC has lost 30% more of its income in real terms over 10, 15 years. A lot of experienced people have left the corporation. I think that could be an element, but when you're dealing with it, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to that. On the other hand, if you're dealing with an independent like that, it's crucial. Either you don't employ them on really controversial issues like this, or you actually reinforce your controls of what's happening. I mean, I could have made this mistake. I hope I wouldn't. I don't think I would, but I could have done. But it needs somebody outside to say, hold on. The tragedy about this, though, is that, we know Trump tells lies. BBC on the whole doesn't. We know when it comes to the Middle East and elsewhere, there's a propaganda war going on. We know when it comes to Daily Telegraph, who's been running this dossier, whatever, they're very anti-BBC, and they always have been. That means you've got to, if you're in the BBC and you're trying to be impartial in a highly polarised world, you've got to be very careful. I mean, I think...
Isn't there an argument here that the whole problem with this is that the BBC failed to get a grip of this situation early on? They could have come straight out, apologised, got on the front foot of this story. They've let it fester for quite a while. And if it was just an innocent mistake, and clearly we won't know that until we see the evidence or hear from the BBC or whatever, but assuming that it was an innocent mistake, just get on the front foot, get a grip and say, we're really sorry we've made a mistake here. It's festered and it's been a bad week for the BBC.
Well, it has, and it's festered, and you're absolutely right. And I used to present a programme called Feedback, and for Radio 4 for a rather long time, desperately trying to get BBC executives on just to explain themselves. You know, lots of decisions at 55, 45, explain why you did it, acknowledge other people have got a point, but explain yourself. The BBC is notoriously bad. But I think there's one other issue here, which is about governance, and which is a real issue. There used to be trouble when there was a separate BBC Board of Governors and a separate executive board. And there were problems with that. But they decided a few years ago, or a government decided, to put into one board. This means that the chairman of the BBC, as well as the Director General, are sitting on the editorial complaints unit. Now, what should have happened is the chairman should represent the public. If somebody like an advisor have got real concerns, they could go to the chairman, and the chairman should be, or the chairperson should be, independent, be able to look at it. But in this instance, the chair, Samir Shah, is sitting on the same committee as the Director General, as the Director of News and Current Affairs and so on. So he's complicit in the decision. So when an advisor wishes to, as it were, take it further, where do they go to? They don't have anywhere else. And I think you can also see this confusion when people like Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, rings directly up the Director General about saying, which shouldn't happen. We don't want ministers ringing up, you know. They should talk to the chair, who's supposed to represent the public interest. But the chair's complicit. So I think you've got a traditional problem of the BBC saying, oh, well, we must get involved in these rows, stand back or whatever. And it's always been tardy in response. And I now think you have a governance problem, but whose job is it to respond? And it's a mess. It shouldn't be at this scale, but people should be realistic. For example, you know, the Middle East, you'll know this backwards. There's a propaganda war on. There are people who are putting newspapers, say Danny Cohen as director of television. I don't know Danny at all, but he also works for and helps run a media operation which basically defends the state of Israel. That's fine. That's fine. But we should know that. Like there are people on the other side.
But, yeah, and I mean, the Middle East is a story that divides people like little other when it comes to news broadcasting. That is certainly true. But is there also not an element within the BBC that there are still a lot of managers, and it is not the managers that seem to be going in the cuts at the BBC? It seems to be the producers and the programme makers, and as you pointed out, the experience. Is that, it's not an excuse, but is that a reason? I mean, does the BBC need to look at itself and say, we actually don't need as many managers. We need people to make programmes and check programmes and have experience. You know, we always talk about the extra eyes on the cues and listening to the audio. You need as many eyes and ears when you're reporting these things as possible. And it feels like the BBC is lacking that right now.
Yeah, but you've just said two, if I may say so, contradictory things. You've suggested they've got too many managers, and you've said actually you want more people.
But what I'm saying is managers. I'm talking to someone who worked at the BBC for 21 years. There's a lot of managers, and then there'll be lots of... There's not enough producers who necessarily have an editor who's not a manager, but is a senior journalist to oversee things.
I agree, but, most of us like to kick accountants, don't we, and kick managers when we don't agree with the decisions. It's a rotten job. But I think,
There's a lot of them.
In the end, you have to have people who stand up and be accountable. You have to have people who are also prepared to be unpopular, be the only person in the cutting room who doesn't agree with everyone else. But again, you see, another problem, when I was an editor of Panorama, I had the good fortune of I could put a team together where I could choose people and, is he still liable to go off in one direction? I'll put somebody else with them. When you're dealing with independent producers, that is more difficult. But it does mean, therefore, you've got to have an old hack sitting there who's, been through the mill and knows about these things and actually says, I'm not letting this film out the cutting room until you've answered this question. Why have you edited these two bits together? What was the gap between them? 45 minutes, really? Well, you tell the audience that. The important thing is tell the audience.
Yeah,
so they know what they're watching.
Roger, thank you so much for that. That is Roger Bolton, former BBC executive and presenter. interested to get your thoughts on this morning, on whether you think that the BBC has handled this well. The Sunday Times reporting today that the chairman of the BBC, Samir Shah, is expected tomorrow to apologise and admit the corporation made a significant mistake, but saying it was unintentional. They unintentionally misled viewers.
Just on your manager's point, I've just been looking up the BBC report on senior staff. So they publish details of salaries, expenses, gifts, hospitalities, declarations of personal interest for all senior leaders who earn £178,000 or more per year, as well for all members of the BBC board, and they are listed on this webpage that I'm looking at now. I'm looking at it on an iPad, and I'm going to start scrolling, and I'm still scrolling again and again and again, and I'm at the letter N, and I'm going to keep scrolling, and I'm still scrolling, and only now I'm at the end of the list. There's quite a lot of names on here, just to make your point. I worked at the BBC too. There are people who are devoted to making good programmes, but often they get lost in a bureaucracy of management rubbish.
We all know people who were only employed to go to meetings, to write emails about meetings they'd gone to send them to go to another meeting. That was just fact. Right, let's bring in Rosamond Irwin now, who is also with us from the Sunday Times media editor. Morning to you.
Good morning.
Talk to us about what we know about the conversations at the BBC, how they've got themselves in this mess, that they've not kind of got on the front foot with this, and only now we're hearing that there's potentially going to be this apology tomorrow.
Well, I think there definitely is going to be an apology tomorrow. I mean, it's what I've written in today's paper. Now, you don't ever want to tempt fate. I mean, I don't particularly like stories that are about things that are going to happen in the future because things change. But I think it's pretty nailed on that Samir Shah is going to apologise tomorrow. Now, of course, that's a full week after the Telegraph first broke this part of the story. And so it is remarkable that it's taken the BBC so long. And they're specifically obviously going to apologise on the issue around the Panorama, the edit of Donald Trump's speech that is misleading. And I think they're going to say it wasn't sort of malicious or sort of intended. But I mean, I don't really quite understand that argument. And I have talked to a lot of people in TV this week, and, you know, people who sort of cross all types of TV. And they've all talked about this being a Franken edit, which is when in reality TV, things are spliced together to make someone say something they didn't actually say. And this sort of thing, well, we wouldn't get away with that. So how on earth do you think you get away with that on news, on a news documentary? So, a lot is moving very quickly on this. Within the BBC, I think they've been incredibly slow to get on the front foot on this. And obviously there's this sort of secondary line that's going around that it's sort of some sort of right-wing conspiracy to attack the BBC. And obviously, look, there are many people who are very critical of the BBC, and a lot of them are on the political right. But it's sort of dismissive of the broader issue, and they kind of just need to grapple much faster with editorial issues when they come up. Because this is a really straightforward one. This isn't something where you need to go away and investigate. It's a straightforward thing that is misrepresenting what someone's actually said.
Is this a problem with the BBC being a big organisation and struggling to kind of make fast decisions? Or do you think this is a specific problem that really falls at the door of Tim Davie, and he needs to be criticised for the handling of this?
I think he can be criticised for how slow it's been. I mean, people have told me sort of in hiding this week, you know, people at the BBC. And I should say, look, there are lots of journalists at the BBC who are doing absolutely amazing work. I mean, they've actually had if it hadn't been for this, they'd have had a really great week at the BBC, because they'd have had Traitors be this vast success. They've got loads of really good journalism going on there. You know, we actually had some really good panoramas recently. Obviously, the one looking at the police was a good example of a very expensive TV, but, you know, clear public interest. You know, officers have gone because of that documentary. So, you know, you could say there's so much great stuff going on, and lots of those people think that all of this stuff and being so slow to get on the front foot of it, which does rest ultimately with Tim Davie, you know, is a massive problem, because it's detracting from all the brilliant things that the BBC does and all its brilliant journalists do. That all said, I don't think the buck is going to stop with Tim Davie over this one. You can't really expect the Director General to be across every little minute edit. I do think there is a sense on this one, though, that somebody's going to have to go over it. It was really interesting that Peter Fincham, who's pretty, a kind of BBC loyalist, on his podcast this week, he was saying there needs to be a resignation. Now, he was made to resign over the scandal back in 2007 called Crown Gate, which actually has lots of echoes with this one. It was a sort of misrepresentation just in a trailer, not in a, a sort of press promo thing, not in an actual not actually sort of in a documentary, but they had misrepresented, made it look like the Queen was walking out of a sort of photo shoot rather than actually she was literally walking in. So it was very misleading, actually. And so there are past scandals like this, and he had to go over that. He was controller of BBC One. But I think there's a sense that it won't be Tim, but I would be a bit nervous if I was some of the people beneath him.
Gosh, thank you so much. That is Rosamund Irwin. She is media editor of The Sunday Times.